You needed that nonprofit organization who could take the long view and stick with it and get the job done and see it through.
You're listening to Nonprofits Today, the podcast that showcases the incredible impact nonprofits have in our ever-changing world. The podcast that gets the pulse on today's economic, social, political, and humanitarian climate straight from frontline leaders, innovative changemakers, and courageous risk takers in our communities and around the globe. And now, without further ado, here's your host, Sarah Box.
Welcome, everyone. Today's guest transitioned from being a TV business reporter to a nonprofit leader focused on civic development and strategic communications at a particularly pivotal time in his city's economy and history. So I'm Sarah Box, your host of the Nonprofits Today podcast, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our guest, Bill Flanagan. Now, as I mentioned, he is a seasoned broadcast journalist and civic leader, but he has more than 40 years of telling story about Pittsburgh economic transformation. And he is the host and producer of Our Region's Business and the Chief Corporate Relations Officer at the Allegheny Conference and Community Development. That's a mouthful. And he has this unique perspective on how public-private partnerships shape communities. And I think oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, we don't think about doing that type of work where we're partnering in that way. So in this conversation, I'm going to see if we can explore more on, number one, Bill's journey from TV to nonprofit leadership and the evolving landscape of economic development and public-private partnerships and the key lessons he's learned along the way. So with that, let me formally welcome Mr. Bill Flanagan to the podcast.
Good to see you, Sarah. Happy to be part of the conversation.
Well, thanks. You know, you've had, from my reading, it appears, and I'm guessing this is true just from the longevity you've had, that you've had this fascinating career transition from broadcasting into nonprofit, which are very different worlds. I'm assuming. I've never been in broadcast journalism, but I've been in nonprofits. But what motivated that shift?
Well, I think part of just being a journalist, right? I spent 20 years working for KDKA television here in Pittsburgh. That's the CBS television station. And, covering the story of Pittsburgh's transformation after the collapse of the steel industry in the late 70s and early 80s, and all the civic efforts to try to turn the place around. And, I came to Pittsburgh to be a general assignment reporter, covered everything, politics, accidents, crime, all that kind of thing. But being in Pittsburgh during those days in the 80s and the 90s, all of us became business reporters, economics reporters, social justice reporters, because those were the stories that were happening here in those days. So I gravitated more and more, not just to the business piece of that, but also to the impact that business and the economy had on communities, on organizations, on institutions, because those were the stories we were living every day. And as part of that, as I got more and more involved and more interested, I was invited to serve on a couple of nonprofit boards and kind of began to make that transition a little bit in that respect. And then it was about 20 years ago in 2001 that the Allegheny Conference on Community Development, and it is a mouthful, they reached out and asked me if I'd be interested in joining them to oversee both communications and fundraising and development, corporate relations, we called it. So then I had the opportunity to do that for the next 20 years and actually just stepped down from my corporate relations role just a year or two ago, although I'm still working part-time on the communication side. So still telling the story of Pittsburgh after 40 years.
So your focus has stayed the same, just how you're doing it has shifted over time.
Well, it really is, and I've often joked that actually, being working for the Allegheny Conference and working for a news organization, we had a lot in common. I mean, when I think about what I did as a reporter, when you're a reporter, you run around town and you pick up the rugs all over the place and you start screaming, "There's dirt under this rug! There's dirt under this rug! Somebody ought to do something about the dirt." The difference is when I went to work for the Allegheny Conference, we still do the same thing. What's wrong with the community? What ails the community? What needs to be improved in the community to make Pittsburgh more competitive? We still look for the dirt under the rug, but the difference is working for the nonprofit, we actually have a vacuum cleaner. and we can go solve that problem and clean up that rug and get rid of that dirt and really try to move the community forward. So the basics of the kind of the what we do and how we do it are very similar, but where we can take it and where we can go with it is actually different when you have the opportunity to actually solve the problem that as a reporter you're pointing out.
I love it. You mentioned that all of you, I'm going to use my language, and so if it's not accurate, just correct me. But when you first started out, you were like everybody does every story. You're interested in everything back in the day. Has that changed? Is it more specialized now, or do you find reporting as more niched?
Well, I mean, in the very beginning, I was a classic general assignment reporter. That's what they would call us. At KDK was my second job after grad school. And we would cover anything, right? Any kind of story. We're generalists. I think, if you look at the way local television or traditional media operate today, they still tend to be generalists, if anything, maybe even more so because they tend to be shorter staffed than in the heyday of mass media and local television and big city newspapers and all of that. They tend to have smaller staffs. They have to do more, so everybody tends to be a generalist. What I did, starting in the very late 80s, was gravitate into business reporting, which was a specialty, one of the few specialties that we had. And again, that was an outgrowth of what we were experiencing here in Pittsburgh and just the severe economic setback we had suffered. So I became more of a specialist doing that. But even today, and I still do my weekly show called Our Region's Business on the NBC television station here at WPXI. But I always say, yeah, it's called Our Region's Business, but it's really, I can do any story that has a dollar sign associated with it. So I do business stories, I do economic stories, I do nonprofit stories. I do, scholarship stories, talent stories. It still is very broadly drawn because in the world of broadcasting especially, you don't have the luxury of tremendous amounts of specialization. I think one of the big changes is, yes, with the growth of social media and new media, increasingly we're all living inside our narrow little channels where we can choose to hear what we want to hear. I come out of the old school, right, where the mass media gathers everybody, right? You have to. That's the business model, and so you have to have people with widely differing opinions, and you got to make sure their concerns are represented. But the value of that, in my view, is that everybody has to be exposed to the views of people they disagree with, and nowadays in the current media environment, it's pretty easy to avoid that and just listen to people who think the way you do. So the media has changed dramatically, but if you're looking at the more traditional media, I think they still tend to be fairly generalist in the way they approach things.
So I had two reasons for asking that question. One is thinking further about, like, if I'm a nonprofit, am I just going to a general reporter, like someone who's a all around town kind of person, or has the system changed where it's more specialized? So yeah. It sounds like depending on my community, it might be a general person.
Yeah, well, I think you need to understand, we talk about the media as if it's one thing, but media is actually a plural word, right? The media are made up of many mediums. And I think you really have to understand what medium you're trying to communicate through or communicate with. And certainly in every community, you're going to have the traditional types of media, television stations, newspapers, radio stations, and then they're likely to have more generalists. And you have to be able to tell your story in a way that a more general reporter is going to be attracted to it and want to cover it. But in addition to that now, there are opportunities like what we're doing, podcasts, and there might be a number of podcasters or influencers in your community, and you have to get to know who they are. And do they want to have a conversation about nonprofits? Well, that'd be great. There may be other podcasters where they wouldn't want to have that conversation. And so you have to learn, well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time chasing the ones who do something different. Let me identify the folks who are the most interested in telling the kinds of stories that I have to share. The beauty of the traditional media is they're kind of fair game for everybody. If you can still try to identify that reporter who's interested in what you have in the story you have to tell, and hopefully they'll help share it.
So from your vantage point now, with your long history with the Allegheny, Conference, did you shift your approach to communications over time? as the media changed? And can you share with us how you thought about that?
Well, I mean, I've had to adjust. I mean, obviously, I started my career, as I said, in the world of mass media before there was any such thing. Well, before there was really the internet. When you think about it, you go back to the 1980s, and certainly well before, smartphones and social media came along. So yes, you have to adjust to that. And you have to use all the different channels that you have available. So, I don't do stories for the 6 o'clock news anymore, but I did that for over 20 years. And now I mostly focus on a weekly television show, which is still, a mass production. But in addition to the television show, we're chopping up pieces and we're putting it out on social media. Or you're thinking about, well, my interview segments are 5 minutes long. Well, some people only want to listen to 90 seconds. So can I post that to Facebook or to LinkedIn or to some other channel? So having that flexibility to think about the various audiences, where they are, how they want to receive information, and then tailoring the information to them is more important than ever before. And it's different. As I say, in the old days, we would produce a story and everybody would get the same story, for better or worse. And you tried to be fair and you tried to include different viewpoints. Nowadays, you can really tailor the message a little more for the interests of the individuals you're trying to communicate with.
So let's talk So when I think about that, what it has me going to is I know a lot of the smaller nonprofits, not as big as your conference, excuse me,
Sure.
they struggle with having the time to grab a story, number one, capture it, and then chop it up, and then make sure it's getting to who needs it. And so this is just kind of something, if you have a tip for how they can think about it, maybe starting small, where would you point them to? Like, would they start with identifying who? Are they going broad, generalist?
Yeah, I'd start with the what, actually. What is it what is the story I'm trying to share? I mean, I think it begins internally, and perhaps with your team, and maybe it's a very small nonprofit, you got a very big team, but really trying to identify what is it we're doing that the world needs to know about, right? And what are we doing that's different than anybody else that the world needs to know about? Because it's usually that different piece. We do this thing better, we do this thing more, or we have a bigger impact over here than anybody else. That begins to make it newsworthy. And then once you've identified, well, we have this product or service or program or result that the world needs to know about, then you can turn outside and then you can begin to think about, well, what media out there are reaching the audience that we want to hear our message, right? I had a colleague for many years who said, if you're trying to communicate with the general public, you're not communicating at all, because it's impossible to frame the message that everybody wants to listen to. So it's important to think about, well, what am I trying to accomplish with this communication that I'm going to do? I always say, who do you want to communicate with and what do you want them to do? And, it might be, well, I want to raise money. So, okay, so now I'm trying to, communicate with foundations, or I'm trying to communicate with the government, or I'm trying to communicate with wealthy individuals or whomever. And then as you begin to identify those audiences that you want to activate, then you begin to ask yourself, well, okay, what media are they listening to, right? Are they listening to a particular podcast that's focused on what we do? Are they watching a television show? Are they reading the newspaper or consuming digital media? And that'll begin to point you then toward the media organization that you should go and approach and try to reach. And the more that your target audience is aligned with their audience, the more likely they're going to be to tell your story and to want to work with you to do it. So I kind of follow that pattern. Figure out what your story is, what really sets you apart, who you need to reach to satisfy your own goals. And then secondly, what medium is going to be the best vehicle to help you do it. And if you can answer all those earlier questions, I think there's a better chance the media organization will pick up the story and run with it.
Sweet. I'm very interested in the public-private partnership model that you work, right? And I know when I was my second nonprofit organization I ran, they said, well, we're a public-private partnership. And I'm thinking, I have no clue what this is. I don't, so I know what the structure was for us, and it was high partnership with the state and local government along with all the nonprofit pieces. But it ran a nonprofit, but the thinking was different within it. And that was different for me because I came from a strictly nonprofit before that. But now you're on a larger basis because you're really doing a whole community-wide thing versus a service type, public-private. So will you share with us what that looks like? Is one of my main things, just like what the structure of that looks like so that other leaders could listen. And then I want to ask you a little bit about what you've done that you've seen be very effective.
Yeah, well, first, can I give you a little bit of the history? Because I think to
Please.
understand how we talk about public-private partnership in Pittsburgh may or may not be the same as the way people think about it across the country. But I've worked for an organization called the Allegheny Conference on Community Development since 2001. That's when I came over from the television station to do this full time. The conference itself was founded back in the 1940s by business leaders in Pittsburgh who became very concerned that once the war was over, nobody would want to live in Pittsburgh. This was one of the most polluted places on the planet because we had 24 steel mills up and down the valleys here in Western Pennsylvania who collectively had produced more tons of steel during World War II than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. So an unimaginable amount of industrial output, but also an unimaginable amount of pollution that resulted. I mean, this was the smoky city. Pittsburgh had that reputation. Businessmen would bring an extra white shirt to work every day so they could change their shirt at lunchtime because their collars would have turned gray. And God forbid you would go to your afternoon meetings with a gray collar. Never mind you were breathing that stuff, right? So that was the degree and then there was pollution in the rivers and industrial pollution and raw sewage. I mean, it really was a pit. I mean, it was living up to its name. And so actually it was the business leaders in town, along with the president of Carnegie Tech, today's Carnegie Mellon University, who got together and said, you know what, if we don't clean this place up, there's not going to be a future for Pittsburgh. Nobody's going to want to live here. When the soldiers and the sailors and they all come home from the war, they're going to go anywhere else in America except for Pittsburgh. So they agreed in the spring of 1943 to form a committee for post-war planning that would take on these big issues. And remember, in those days, there was no EPA, there was no environmental regulation in Pennsylvania. And so they sat down as this group of business leaders and said, all right, we have to figure out how to regulate ourselves and how to come up with solutions that will force us collectively to do a better job. And, you know, it was really about the sustainability, environmental sustainability of Pittsburgh. So that's what they did. They agreed to form this committee for post-war planning. And here's where the public-private partnership comes in. The following year, after they did that, a fellow named David Lawrence was named or was elected the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh. And he was a Democratic mayor, classic, you know, the boss, you know, that type of a Democratic mayor. But he then partnered with Richard King Mellon, who was a big banker in town, one of the wealthiest men in America in those days. And he was the leader of this business group that formed the Allegheny Conference. So the Allegheny Conference was formed as a vehicle to bring together the business community and today more broadly the private sector. So we have nonprofit members, the foundations are members, the universities are members. In the beginning, it was just business. And then they could partner with Mayor Lawrence to do the civic engineering that they needed to do to clean up the smoky skies, to get the pollution out of the river, to engage in urban redevelopment. So ever since then, the conference in Pittsburgh has used that same model. We bring together the private sector to identify issues, develop strategies to solve them, and then ultimately we partner and work together with government, often the city, sometimes the county, could be the state, every now and then it's the federal government, to then implement the solutions and ultimately make Pittsburgh more competitive or give it a higher quality of life or whatever the goal is. But it's always the same model of let's develop the solution together. Let's then sit down with government and figure out how to implement it. And that's what happens. And that's what's been happening here in Pittsburgh for the past 80 years.
Well, you have a long track record.
Well, and the beauty of it is, and the nice part is after all these years, people are still willing to come together and do it, you know, when we have a challenge or an opportunity. But I think they're willing to do it because we've got a track record, right? And we have done it and we have had success doing it. And we've had to respond to unbelievable challenges, but we've also been able to unlock a really exciting opportunities. And so people here in Pittsburgh know hey, if something new comes up, we're willing to get together in a room and kick around and see if we can solve it because we've got this wonderful track record of having done it before.
I was going to ask you about the sustainability of it, because sometimes you have those efforts where people come together, but where the wheels start to fall off is when it's time to get, people have great ideas, but then who's implementing, who's tracking it, who's keeping the energy moving forward. So 80 years is a track record. And so if you got a call and said, hey, we're working on this, people go, okay, my time will not be wasted.
Well, and that's a big part of it. I mean, the thing about Pittsburgh and what the Allegheny Conference has been able to do, and we're a 501c3. We operate a little like a Chamber of Commerce, like a C6, but we're actually a charitable organization under the tax code. And the advantage of that is we take a really long-term view. One of the challenges is most of our business members, they have to answer to the next quarter for Wall Street. If it's a publicly traded company, that's their worldview. I just have to get through the next 3 months. Most politicians have a hard time looking beyond the next election. So, right, it could be 2 years, it could be 4 years. It's seldom longer than that for any elected official. So who can really be the guide to get through a challenge or capture an opportunity that might take 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? And, my favorite story is back in the 1940s, Pittsburgh. If you went down to the point where our rivers meet, so you have the Allegheny and the Monongahela, and they meet to form the Ohio River, right? And in the old days, where that point was, it was a rail yard, and it was basically warehouses and an industrial slum. And so way back in 1944, the Allegheny Conference first started to talk about, well, we should build a park and a fountain at the point. And we're going to create this wonderful green oasis in the middle of this incredibly dirty city. That'll really be a place for people to enjoy outdoor recreation and get a break from the industrial nature of the community. So they first wrote about it and talked about it in 1944. They finished the park and turned on the fountain in 1974. It took 30 years. And a lot of people say, 30 years, knock down some buildings, plant some grass, put in a fountain. How in the world could it have taken 30 years? But the reality was the environment was so awful here that nobody would have wanted to go to a park in the beginning, right? I mean, soot rained from the sky, the rivers flooded every spring, and they would have covered the park with sewage and industrial pollution. So you couldn't do the park and the fountain first. They had to come at the very end. So, nowadays our fountain in Pittsburgh, when we turn it on in the spring, and it should be happening right around now, it really was the exclamation point on the 30 years of effort, this public-private partnership to clean up Pittsburgh, get the smoke out of the air and get the pollution out of the rivers, and really create a much higher quality of life. And it was really the conference as this nonprofit organization that could take that long-term view. The mayor who was there at the beginning was not the mayor at 30 years later. The business leaders who started the process were not the business leaders when they finished 30 years later. You needed that nonprofit organization who could take the long view and stick with it and get the job done and see it through. And it doesn't always take 30 years to do things around here. I have seen this cycle of public-private partnership, but we've done it in 30 years, we've done it in 6 years, we've done it in 6 weeks. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. But this ability to come together and identify the challenge or the opportunity, develop a plan and implement it is something we've gotten pretty good at in Pittsburgh over the past 80 years.
Well, how do you help in the environment where, and I'm speaking specifically from a nonprofit view, where funders say, what impacts will you have for me in the next 18 months, when the first 12 months is actually getting everybody on board and getting the train on the tracks and rolling? How do you help people understand that those big impacts they want may only be like tiny steps forward, not tiny in the fact that you're not getting results, but they may not be visible. They're not your fountain. They're the things that have to happen first. How do you work with folks on that?
Well, there's two pieces to that. And one is we're very fortunate here in Pittsburgh to have an extremely high concentration of foundations that operate in Pittsburgh. So I think we have the second or third highest concentration of foundation assets under management in the United States, second or third only to Seattle and maybe another community. So enormous relative to our size. The other piece is that the foundations are actually participants in the process. So they serve on the board of the Allegheny Conference, this long-term view organization. So they're helping to influence those decisions. And so it gives us this incredible edge over so many other communities. I call it patient social venture capital. And that's what the foundations are able to provide here in Pittsburgh, millions of dollars every year that give us the resources to do things, but also to make mistakes. And again, because of our track record, they're willing to, if we screw up and we don't get the result, they'll give us another chance. So there's a wonderful culture here that makes it easier. But, you do have to prove yourself and you have to prove you can deliver the results. And so the other thing we do here, when we put one of these plans together, we just don't say, okay, well, we want this fountain. It's going to take us 30 years. Hang in there with us. And, well, we're going to die, just hang on, right? So typically when we organize projects, we'll think, well, what are the milestones? What's the low-hanging fruit? What can we do along the way to demonstrate we're delivering a result or we're getting better or things are actually improving toward that long-term goal? So it's actually a thoughtful process when you're putting the work plan together and the strategy together. Well, where are we going to have the results along the way that prove to our funders, to our partners, to the community at large, especially the elected officials, that we're moving in the right direction and we're going to deliver the result that we've promised? And I think that's been one of the keys to be able to keep everybody organized and on board for some of these projects that can take many years.
Yeah. Well, and having milestones, if you're working on a project and it's a long project, long-term project, having milestones keeps the momentum. Like when you go to work, you're knowing we're making progress. This is where we're headed now, and that will lead to something later. But right now, this is our success measure.
And really a good point. And when we put a new group together, for example, especially business leaders, because they tend not to have a whole lot of patience, right? You're asking these CEOs or C-level people to get involved. And, but what we have found is, yeah, you might have a long-term project you might want them to work on. But if you can give them a little win, doesn't have to be a big win, but you give them a little win in the first 6 months or the first year. And then if they feel like, oh, I got to win. Well, CEOs are very competitive, right? If they feel like we did that, then they want to do the next one, and then they want to step it up and do a little bit more. So the other way we talk about it is what are going to be the wins along the way, and every win we can give them, it's going to motivate them not just to do more, but to do a lot more in some cases, to really invest and get excited and help move things forward.
Well, and sometimes it takes a while for people like. They're enthusiastic in the beginning, but they don't actually see how powerful their individual impact is. And when you start seeing that, you think, oh, wow, that was so easy for us to do that little piece. We could do more.
No, and it is. And I think it's so important to demonstrate that kind of progress and that results. And up front in the beginning, we're not going to change the world in the next 6 months, but here's what could happen, right? If we all work together and we get involved. And again, it's just part of the process of how we work through these partnerships here in Pittsburgh.
How do you share with the broader community the impact of these individuals in your partnerships? Like, do you update the community and say, because we have this group, whomever it is, that this is what's happened, so your partners are getting recognized as your champions and partners along the way?
Oh, absolutely. And, historically, the Allegheny Conference, before they hired me, actually, one of the reasons they hired me prior to that time, they would literally do an annual meeting once a year. But it wasn't an annual meeting just to the nonprofit. They turned it into a huge community or civic event. And we would have 1,500 civic leaders from all over Pittsburgh who would get together for the annual meeting in November, and the conference would report out, here's what we achieved. And the report would be done by the business leaders, not by the executives of the nonprofit. So the board members would get up and they would report to the community on what had been achieved. And then they would also lay out, okay, here's what we're going to do for the next 12 months, right? And here's our plan and our strategy. Please support us. And then they would kind of disappear, for the next year while they work through all the programs. It's a little different now. We now have quarterly meetings with our members and focus groups and various ways to do outreach and include people in the process and galvanize the activity. But I think the one through line that's made the conference a little unusual, perhaps compared to other organizations, is we tend to always put our volunteer leadership out in front. And when I was hired, I was told that joining the Allegheny Conference is like joining the Men in Black as staff. Our role is to develop a fact-based case for great decision making by our volunteer leadership. And then they will get up and they will announce to the community what we've done and what we're doing. And we as staff will be standing in the shadows at the back of the room, and we'll put them out in front, and we'll make sure they're prepared. And we do all that heavy lifting to make sure that they can lead, right? But even within the conference within the culture of the conference, and it's different, I think, when you hear a lot of Chamber of Commerce type organizations. You'll often hear chamber executives, when they're talking about the board, they'll talk about the volunteers. So we're the paid staff, we run the Chamber of Commerce, and then we have the volunteers who are on the board. At the Allegheny Conference, from the moment I was hired, they never talked about them as the volunteers. The board, that was the leadership. The board members, those business leaders, those nonprofit leaders who gathered together, they were the leadership. We're staff. We're supposed to make them successful. We're supposed to enable them to lead. And it's a subtle difference, but it really, I think it's one of the reasons why we get such incredible participation by the members of our board. I mean, most of our board is 50 or 60 people. Most of them are the CEOs of some of the largest companies in the country. And they come to the board meetings and they chair committees and they actually get involved and do things. But that's because, they are the leaders, right? And just the same way they lead their companies, they can lead the community. And that's a real big part of the culture. And it's something we constantly work at. And I think it's very different than what you see in business membership organizations across the country.
I would agree. And because you provide them staff support, it doesn't become an undue burden. They can do what they do, which is lead.
Yep.
They don't have to worry about.
And related to that, on the public sector side too, one of the reasons we're able to be effective in bringing together the public sector and why there's trust and a willingness to come together is, in some ways, we function as an adjunct staff for the mayor or for the county executive, or to a lesser extent for the governor, where we're providing resources or information or research or that they might not otherwise have access to. And that means that they begin to trust, and it doesn't matter whether the Republicans or Democrats, or if they hold that office, we support the office. We provide additional resources and staff and thinking to support the office of the whatever. It doesn't matter who holds it. And then that leads to trust. And then that makes it easier to get together. And then again, when you get to the point of cutting that ribbon, we as staff are standing in the back of the room, and it's the mayor who cuts the ribbon along with the committee leader from the business community. And they're up there in front, and deservedly so, because we've made it sure they really did do the work and they provided the leadership. We just enabled them to do that.
Well, you can say you just enable them. That takes a lot of coordination and focus behind the scenes to do that and keeping people engaged. But that is so important. Otherwise, people, other things come up that are priorities that are their own businesses, and they start going, if I've got to do all this other stuff, I can't support you. Much as I care about this commission and what you guys are doing at the conference, I can't. And that's what's so great about the way you have approached this, is being kind of the support, or the common thing like the servant leaders behind the scene to make sure it gets done. And not necessarily requiring your own patting yourselves on the back about it.
Well, yeah, and I think that was when I was hired. And again, I came at it out of journalism and out of news for many years, so I hadn't worked in any of this area. But I ultimately concluded after a few years that really that one of the core competencies of the staff of the Allegheny Conference was in preparing leaders to make really good decisions to benefit the community, right? And that was so fundamental to the success of the organization, and it was so baked into the culture. But it's also why there was such trust in how we could work across geographic lines, political lines, industries, whatever it took, because that was the philosophy that underpinned it all.
Yeah. So I'm imagining a nonprofit executive or team person's listening to you and they're thinking, okay, I'm not sure how to get started on this. So what advice might you give that person who wants to build stronger partnerships with the private sector? How might they start?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is you got to start the conversation at some level, and I think sometimes it's not going in with an ask. I think there's a temptation. We need money. Let's go ask for the money, or or you go to a lawmaker. We need this law change. Let's go lobby, right? I think the better way to begin is say, I need your advice. We're trying to solve this problem, whatever we do as a nonprofit, and you've got some expertise. I'm not here today to ask for any money. But I want to tap your, can I pick your brain for a little bit? Because I've got this problem I need to solve, and I really could use the kind of expertise you as the business leader, or you as the senator, or the congressman, or the councilman that you could bring to the table. Can we just get together over coffee or have kind of an informal meeting and begin to talk this through? And once you get some of their input, well, then you can begin to bring that to life. And I think as you begin to take their advice and implement it even in a modest way, you can invite them in for a deeper conversation and more of a partnership. But I do think in the beginning, it's helpful to just begin to build that relationship and open that connection and show that you're listening. To me, that's so important, no matter who you're dealing with. And then on down the road, it could mean, to really significant leadership or to big donations or whatever it takes. But I think beginning to build that relationship and then getting others to work together too. One of the values you can bring to the table as well, it's not just me and you, but, councilman, whatever, or Miss Business Leader, there's somebody you need to meet that I've been working with. And you two are really think about these things together. Maybe we can get all in a room together and kind of work through these problems. So then you're helping them build their networks as well. And that's so important, especially inside a membership organization, that they get to meet each other and work together and work through some of these problems and challenges. And so I guess in my view, that's kind of where it begins. That's a way to begin.
Well, you're creating relationships instead of just transactions. That whole thing, like, I need something. It's like, how nice. Everybody does.
Everybody. And everybody's knocking on my door, right? And I don't even know how to choose, where I should go or what I should do. It's interesting because a big part of my job for many years at the conference was basically membership sales. Now we call them regional investors, and they're making a charitable donation. They're not buying a membership. But I would often, because so many businesses are used to the Chamber of Commerce model, right, where you buy a membership, you're a member of your Chamber of Commerce, and then they ask you, well, what are the benefits of the membership, right? And often that means how many events do I get for free, how many tickets to this or that, and it's a very transactional relationship inside a Chamber of Commerce. And so I've been asked that question by business leaders, and I'm trying to recruit them to become one of our regional investors, and they'll say, Bill, well, what are the benefits if I do this? And I'll sit back and I'll say, you know what? There are absolutely no benefits. The benefit to you is the nice warm feeling you're going to get down in your belly when you do something really good to help the community. And in the long run, your business is going to benefit because we're going to have a better community. But in the near term, this is really about you contributing what you have to give to be able to help the community. And some people don't like that. And usually when they balk at that, I know immediately, we really don't want you as a member of the Regional Investors Council. You're in it for the wrong reasons. But most people I've dealt with, I'd really like to do that. I think that's an important thing to do. And then what I'll tell them, it's not the lead of the sale, right? Because I first want to get them hooked on this idea that they're going to have a voice, they're going to have influence, they're going to be able to shape the future for the community and for the business. Then I'll sit down and I'll say, oh, by the way, I'm going to put you on a committee or a commission or a task force, and we're going to go solve this particular problem that you're really concerned about. And you're going to be working on that problem with fellow business leaders from across the community. And you're a marketing person, right? Well, sitting in that room is going to be a banker and a lawyer and these other occupations. And in the course of working through the problem together, they're going to think, oh, wow, she really had some great ideas on the marketing side. Maybe I'll see if she wants to come work with me professionally. So I said there's these indirect benefits of building these relationships that will help your business. But that's not why you should join the conference or support our efforts to move the region forward. Those are going to be indirect benefits, but they are very real. So we would use that as part of the pitch as well.
So what was interesting to me about that, as you said, if they balk at that, they may not be who you want there, right? So that's a filtering thought in your head. It's like they're probably not in the right mindset to be in our group. And to other people, to the external people who are the right people, if I were that person, I would feel confidence. Like I'm going to be working with people who are serious, who are the same minded towards our community or whatever. So that's a bonus or a benefit. And I think for folks listening, it's really good to be discerning and don't say yes just to anybody, right?
Well, and there is that temptation. You're strained financially. Particularly if you're in development, the boss has set like targets for how many new members you have to attract or whatever. But my feeling, what I've always told my team on the development side of the membership side is, look, you don't kill yourself to sell somebody who's going to be unhappy, because at the end of the day, you're going to waste so much time trying to make them happy, and they're never going to be happy, and then they're going to drop their membership in a year. So if you get in that kind of sort of adversarial dynamic, just thank them very much for their time. I've said, just get out of the meeting as fast as you can. Graciously, don't burn a bridge, but that's not going to lead anywhere. Go on to the next person who really shares the values of the organization and what we're trying to achieve together. And that person they're going to be great. They're going to roll up their sleeves. They're going to help us solve problems. They're going to pay their membership. And who knows, over the long run, they might even do more to contribute to advance the cause. I mean, we're open to everybody. We've certainly never turned down anybody who wants to be a member. But I've always tried to vet them a little bit and make sure that, are they really going to be happy? Do they have that personality type that this is going to be rewarding for them? Because if it isn't, they're going to be that. I'm going to be their problem, and they're going to be my problem. So better head that off at the very beginning.
My feeling is like there's always a place for people. It just might not be this place.
Well, good to put it. Yep. And I've done that. I mean, we do that. There's 70 chambers of commerce in southwestern Pennsylvania that surround. Some of them are really big. I mean, in terms of membership, and some of them are small. They're like Main Street chambers. But, if we get somebody on the phone and, what are you interested in doing? Why do you want to belong to the organ? Oh, well, I'm here to drum up leads for my business. I want to come to your monthly business card exchange, and I want to meet as many other businesses as I can, because this is all about generating revenue for me. And I'll tell those people, you know what? Let me introduce you to the Airport Area Chamber of Commerce, or there's a wonderful Chamber of Commerce in Washington County, and you're located down in Washington County. Let me make that connection for you, because that's what you want. They're going to deliver the results you want. I don't think you're going to be happy, being a member of the Regional Investors Council. And, we do that. And I think it's so important that there's a good mix, especially because, our whole effort is around galvanizing leadership to move the region forward. And if you're philosophically not on the same page, you're never going to be happy.
Well, and what a service you did. It's like when you're saying, we're not it, but I know who is. Let me help you get there. And that's you can take it down to like even a service, a smaller general service. And when someone says, I'm not the best person for you because of ABC, but I know who I would refer you to, that's a service in and of itself. So strategically, it's a smart move to do that. It reduces friction on your end, but it also puts them in a place where they might actually get what they want, and they will still have fond feelings about you in the conference.
Well, and people talk, right? If you have a bad experience, even if it's just that interaction in the course of a sales call or a membership call, they'll tell other people in town, oh, that Bill Flanagan, he was really obnoxious. He was snobby. He just sent me on oh no, you know what? It wasn't really a good fit for us, but he put me in touch with so-and-so, and I've made 3 new contacts, and now I've been able to add 3 people to my staff because of my new business. Now, their business is better, the community's benefited, and there's more goodwill. So, I think it's really important to do that.
I think that's great. So as we wrap this up, Bill, I would like to ask you to leave us, our listeners, myself, whoever is listening today, and in the future, with a few words of wisdom for how we approach our work, public, private, nonprofit, but the headspace or heart space you recommend us approach it from?
Yeah, well, when I first got the job, so again, I was working as a reporter for 20 some years, and I'd been on a couple of boards and, but had hardly done any fundraising. And that was going to be a big part of my job. And when I was being interviewed by our CEO at the time, and he said, yeah, well, we want you to raise all this money. And, our budget at the time was like $7-8 million a year. And I said, well, Rick, you got to understand, I've never raised more than $35,000 for any charity in my life. I don't know. I want to be honest about this. And he said, oh, you don't have to worry very much. You just send a letter once a year and they send you a check. And it's little did I know. But I mentioned that because I really had to come to grips with the fact, can I really do this? And then as I began to do it, what I realized that what I did as a journalist had really prepared me to be effective in the nonprofit environment as well, whether it was fundraising or partnership building or galvanizing the community. Because if you're a reporter and you're a good reporter, yes, we go on television and we talk a lot and we write a lot and we tell our stories, but long before we get there, we're in a conversation with somebody. And if you're a really good reporter, you really listen to what they have to say. And you ask follow-up questions and you try to get deeper and you try to understand, what are they concerned about? What are they happy about? What's the story that I want to tell? You really try to get to understand them. And what I learned that going into the nonprofit space, especially on the development and the partnership side, it's really the same drill. Can you listen to the people you're talking to? Can you understand where they're coming from? Can you have empathy if they have a problem? Can you get excited if they have a solution? And then can you help them make the connections they need for them to succeed and for you to succeed? So to me, the number one thing that I've learned along the way is just how critically important it is to be open to other people, to listen to their concerns, to listen to their great ideas, and not to go in with the sort of preconceived ideas of how to move forward, but to constantly be open to something you can learn and something you can do differently or better. To benefit your organization, but also to benefit them.
Great advice. Bill, if folks wanted to reach out to you and get more information or just connect with you, what is your favorite place to send them to?
Well, I'm a baby boomer, so I'm still more of an email person, but I have a LinkedIn profile. It's just Bill Flanagan. It's pretty easy to find. And I am on Facebook, and I also communicate that way, probably a little more toward LinkedIn. But, if people just want to shoot me an email, I'm more than happy to respond and strike up a conversation. It's just bflanagan@AlleghenyConference.org. It's a mouthful of a name. But again, bflanagan@AlleghenyConference.org.
We'll put it in the show notes for you. So
excellent. That's great.
People can just copy and paste it in there.
Because nobody knows how to spell Allegheny.
I could make mistakes spelling Bill too. I mean, Flanagan, right?
So
I looked at him thinking, oh, it's all A's. Okay.
Oh, Flanagan. I get that all the time, right? Yeah.
So we'll put it in the show notes, listeners. So, because I've super enjoyed listening to Bill. You've brought up some things I've never considered before. And I think you present them in a very fresh and accessible way. So I want to thank you for being a guest on the Nonprofits Today podcast, Bill.
Happy to do it. I really enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to Nonprofits Today with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic nonprofit coach, Sarah Box. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah and the Sandbox team at sarahbox.com. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible, so be sure to rate, review, and share this podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. And be sure to tune in and power up with future episodes of Nonprofits Today.